Long ago, back in the days when Nebraska and Georgia Tech were relevant teams, there was no college football national championship game. All there was to indicate the number one team were the rankings decided by the two major national polls at the end of the season, the Associated Press poll and the coaches poll. This often ended in two different teams claiming national titles if the polls didn't have the same number one team at the end of the season. And top teams would oftentimes play inferior competition in their bowl games due to conferences having contracts with bowl games, like the Southwest Conference with the Cotton Bowl and the Southeast Conference with the Sugar Bowl. The first attempt at making a national title game happened in 1992 when the SEC, Big 8, Southwest Conference, ACC, and Big East formed the Bowl Coalition to agree to send the two highest-ranked conference champions among them to the same bowl game to determine a national champion. Now, if you're a big college football fan, you probably realize that I didn't list the Pac-12 or the Big 10 Conference in this coalition. That's because they were both contractually obligated to send their champions to the Rose Bowl to face each other every year. These two conferences' absence proved to be the fatal flaw of the coalition when Penn State, a member of the Big 10, went 12-0 in the regular season and was ranked number 2 in the country in both polls, but could not play in the Orange Bowl against number 1 Nebraska. This caused the conferences to go back to the drawing board and come up with the exact same thing? The Pac-12 and Big 10 were still excluded, but with the newly named Bowl Alliance, the coaches poll was now guaranteed to rank the winner of the national championship as number 1, which they kind of already did, but I mean, now it's on paper. So anyways, they ran into the same problem of missing a number 1 or number 2 team in the national title game in 1997 and 1998, as well as excluding other conference champions from top-tier bowls like number 5 BYU in 1996. Facing a potential antitrust lawsuit for its control over bowl games, the Alliance had to come up with something completely different now. That's why in 1998, the Alliance reformed into the BCS, the Bowl Championship Series, which finally included the Pac-12 and Big 10, as well as the mid-major conferences. And by 2006, the national championship game became its own dedicated bowl game separate from the other BCS bowl games. This was a huge improvement, but it still left teams with historic and even undefeated seasons out of the question of whether or not they deserved to be the national champions. In 2014, the BCS finally answered every fan's prayers to create a playoff that would be more inclusive and leave no one snubbed out of a shot at the title. They only expanded it to 4 teams? I mean, I guess that's better, right? It really depends on how you look at it whether or not it's better this way. Let's just start with the improvements. Number 1, there are now more teams that have a chance at a national title. Kind of obvious, but it's important not to overlook after discussing all that crap that we had to go through just to get to this point. Other than that, I mean, the trophy looks cool. As for the downsides, there's quite a few. First, the BCS's ranking system of combining national polls and computer models was replaced by a committee of 13 people to decide all the rankings. While the original BCS model was flawed in many ways, it had close to no human bias. While the College Football Playoff Committee year to year has consisted mostly of athletic directors, professors, former players, and former coaches that all have clear ties to conferences and schools. This has left schools from less powerful conferences out of the playoff, like the 11-1 TCU Horned Frogs in 2014 and the 12-0 UCF Knights in 2017. Another issue that has become more apparent over the past few years is the lack of variety in teams that are featured in the playoff year to year. Right now, we have 5 conferences that send a variation of essentially the same 6 teams to the playoffs nearly every year, with an exception or 2 sprinkled in each year. This isn't a coincidence either. It's a cycle that makes things worse with every year that passes. Let me explain how this works. Let's just say, hypothetically, that you're a 5-star recruit and your top 5 schools are Florida, Iowa, Alabama, Penn State, and USC. Even though those are all historically elite programs and have all had their fair share of time in the top 25 for the past few years, guess which school can guarantee that you'll play in the college football playoff multiple times with them? That's right, it's Alabama, because they've only missed the playoff once, and none of those other teams have even made the playoff once. So that advantage that the perennial playoff teams have over the other elite programs has been keeping top recruits from going to other schools, and it shows. According to 247, Alabama has held the #1 recruiting class 5 times since 2016 and has never dropped lower than 5th in the nation. Ohio State has only missed the top 5 once, and Oklahoma and Clemson have stayed in the top 20 every year. There have only been 4 teams in this time period that have cracked the top 5 in recruiting and still have not been featured in the college football playoff. Ole Miss in 2016, USC in 2017 and 2018, Texas in 2018 and 2019, and Texas A&M in 2019. So after looking at these major issues that we have with the current playoff setup, the first instinct of any fan is to say, oh, just expand the number of teams allowed in. Well, yeah, okay, but if we keep the selection process as a subjective decision by a baker's dozen of people that have obvious biases of certain conferences and teams, we're back at square one with teams being left out that feel like they could have made a run in the postseason. So we're going to take a huge step back and look at all the ways that I could see the college football playoff changing. So my first idea is one that almost definitely will never happen, which I'll explain why later on in this video, but I'm just going to call it the Utopia Plan for now. So in the Utopia Plan, basically all heck breaks loose in how the conferences are aligned. I'm going to have to go through a lot here before it makes much sense, so just bear with me for a couple minutes. In this plan, there are 2 tiers of conferences in the FBS. The major and the minor conferences. The major tier consists of the ACC, Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12, and SEC, along with a new extra conference that I'm calling the Northeast Conference. The minor tier consists of the existing Sun Belt, Mid-American, and Mountain West conferences, as well as 3 new conferences that I'm calling the Great Plains, East Coast, and North Appalachian conferences. So what teams are in the conferences? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I'm about to make people angry with how I realigned each conference. When I was deciding where to put each team, I kept these things in mind: the team's history, location, program prestige, and culture. So let's just jump right into it with the ACC up first. The teams I kept in were Clemson, Duke, Florida State, Georgia Tech, UNC, NC State, Virginia, Virginia Tech, and Wake Forest. The first team I added to the ACC was Maryland, due to them being one of the original members of the ACC and them having long-standing rivalries with just about every other school in the ACC, because everyone hates Maryland. I also added South Carolina for the same reason of them being a founding member of the conference, as well as their huge rivalry with Clemson. And the last team I added was Florida. I'm pissed now! I know that this is a controversial decision, but I do have my reasons. Without the addition of Florida, the ACC wouldn't have a lot of long-term firepower in football outside of Clemson. The Gators also have a huge rivalry with Florida State, and let's not forget that Florida is the second highest academically ranked university in the SEC, behind only Vanderbilt. And no hate to the SEC, but the ACC has always consisted of more academically demanding schools. Next up is the Big 10. So the teams that I kept were Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Michigan State, Minnesota, Nebraska, Northwestern, Ohio State, Penn State, Purdue, and Wisconsin. I only added one team, which was Missouri, because let's face it, it's just too cold for them to fit in with the rest of the SEC. For the Big 12, I kept Baylor, TCU, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, Kansas, Kansas State, and Iowa State. We're also keeping Texas and Oklahoma because screw the SEC. I added Colorado because they were once members of the Big 12, and it makes more sense geographically than for them to be in the Pac-12. I also added Iowa to satisfy their rivalry with Iowa State. Also joining the Big 12 are Arkansas, because even though they've spent the past 30 years in the SEC, they've failed to do anything memorable other than hiring a few of the most hated and incompetent football coaches in NCAA history. A change of scenery with some old foes from the Southwest Conference should be a good thing for the Razorbacks. The Pac-12 didn't change a whole lot because of their location, so I kept every team in other than Colorado and replaced them with BYU. BYU is a big enough, old enough, and successful enough school to hang in there with other Power 5 teams, so I think that they deserve it. The SEC had to see a facelift after I stripped them down of a lot of their teams, so I left them only with Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, LSU, Tennessee, Texas A&M, and Vanderbilt. To fill the void in Florida, I added Miami and UCF, which I think has the potential to become a pretty good rivalry in college football. I also added Houston to the SEC because they've shown over the past decade that they can compete at a high level, not only in football but in other sports too. Finally, we have the Northeast Conference, which is kind of like a reborn version of the Big East. In it, I put Army, Boston College, Cincinnati, Kentucky, Louisville, Navy, Notre Dame, Pitt, Rutgers, Syracuse, and West Virginia. I'm not gonna lie, I don't know everything about the lower tier schools, so I arranged them mostly geographically. And here they all are on a map, because I don't want to spend another 10 minutes listing off all those names. For the postseason, there would still be normal bowl games, but the playoff would be expanded to 8 teams, with 6 of those spots being used as the major conference champions, as well as 2 at-large bids from any conference, major or minor. Now, so far, that's not that crazy of an idea other than messing with the conference alignments, but here's where the fun begins. If a minor tier team wins their conference 2 times in a row, and at that same time, a team from the corresponding major conference ends up dead last 2 times in a row, then those teams swap. So let's say, for example, Louisiana absolutely goes off a couple years in a row in this Sun Belt. And at the same time, Vanderbilt sucks, as they normally do, and finished dead last in the SEC 2 years in a row. That means that Louisiana would be able to replace Vanderbilt the following season, and Vanderbilt would have to wait 2 more seasons at the very earliest to move back up, assuming they win the Sun Belt 2 years in a row, and another team finishes last in the SEC twice in a row. So this is a pretty cool plan, right? It keeps teams on their toes and gives everyone a chance to make the playoffs and play in big-time conferences no matter who they are. But there are still some major unavoidable issues. The first of these issues is talking conference executives into giving up basically all their power so that the NCAA can rearrange the conferences as much as they want without any debate. The next big issue is, how would this work outside of football? Would other sports just change conferences based on how the football team does? Or would they continue on in their normal conference alignment no matter what type of chaos is going on in football? The last issue is, who's to say which teams go in major conferences to start with over others? There are teams like San Diego State, Boise State, and App State that would argue that they've been a lot more successful than teams like Arizona, Kansas, and Duke. This is true, and the only reasons I kept these bad teams in the major tier is because of their history being part of the major conferences. Basically, there's just too many moving parts to actually carry out this plan effectively, so we have to look at something a little more realistic if we want to talk about something that we could actually see happen. The next idea I've heard of and considered is to just adopt the FCS's postseason format with a 2014 bracket, which isn't as bad as you might think in terms of scheduling. There are 5 total rounds, so if you were to start the tournament the week after conference championships, the finals would be held at the same time as what we see now. There are still a lot of issues I have with this postseason style though, so far as to say that the current 14 bracket is still a better option than this one. The first reason why I'm hesitant is because it would completely devalue nearly every other bowl game in existence. If you were to have a 2014 bracket this year with the 10 conference champions and the other 14 ranked teams, the best bowl game outside of the tournament would be between number 21 Arkansas and number 22 Kentucky. That means that almost every other New Year's Six Bowl would feature unranked teams. Now you're probably thinking, oh, but Dalton, if we had a tournament with 24 teams, we'd just make the quarterfinals and semifinals the New Year's Six Bowls. So there, now your problem is fixed, and also you're stupid, so shut up now. Okay. So you think that if a team that wins their quarterfinal game and ends up getting rocked the next week will be all that proud about winning the Fiesta Bowl? Or, in that same thought, the national champion every year will also be the winner of 2 New Year's Six Bowls, but those wins won't really mean that much to them either. No matter how you arrange it, this big of a playoff essentially ruins all other bowl games. The other major issue I have with the 2014 format is that once you get that far down the rankings, it's harder to tell who the better team is. Like, who's to say that Houston, the hypothetical last team in from this year, would deserve a spot more than a team like Kentucky, who only has 1 more loss in them and plays in a much stronger conference. The point is that the more at-large bids you put into a tournament, the more teams there are that will feel as though they've been snubbed. Like, just look at the March Madness bracket. Every year, there are at least 5 teams that could make a strong argument as to why they deserved a spot in the tournament over the last few that just squeaked in. So what we know now is that a full-blown conference realignment is out of the question, and so is an adoption of the FCS bracket format. So what's left? You might be thinking to yourself, oh, the 16-team playoff. You, my friend, are very close, but I personally think that 16 is still a little too big because that would still leave the New Year's 6 looking like this, and these teams getting mad that the selection committee snubbed them because of conference biases. This is why I move that we make it a 12-team playoff, and here's why. So in my ideal 12-team playoff, there would be all 10 conference champions plus 2 at-large bids for the conference runner-ups that still had extremely impressive seasons, and Notre Dame, I guess, because they're independent, whatever. Now, you might think that 2 isn't enough, but in the college football playoff era, apart from 2020's shortened season, there's never been more than 2 teams that finished second in their conference, ranked in the top 10, and had less than 3 losses in the same year. Allowing all 10 conferences to be in the playoff might also seem like a questionable decision, but it's a good decision for the long-term health of college football. If you have every conference champion making it to the playoff, you're giving the smaller conferences the opportunity to show what they're worth against the big-time teams and make a name for themselves on the national level. This also means that if a team goes undefeated, they, by default, will have a spot in the playoff since it's implied that one of those wins on your record is from your conference championship. But going back to the recruiting side of things, even if a team like Northern Illinois that won their conference but virtually has no chance of beating a powerhouse team, they still have on their resume to show to prospects that they played in the college football playoff, instead of saying that they were invited to the 4th best bowl game in Orlando, Florida. The 12-team format also leaves enough room for the New Year's 6 Bowls to still be meaningful by featuring top 25 matchups and showcasing future NFL players on primetime television. If we were to have the 12-team playoff this year, here's what the matchups would have been based on the college football playoff rankings. Number 6 Ohio State versus number 14 Oregon in the Rose Bowl. Number 8 Ole Miss versus number 9 Oklahoma State in the Sugar Bowl. Number 10 Michigan State versus number 16 Oklahoma in the Peach Bowl. And number 15 Iowa versus number 13 BYU in the Fiesta Bowl. Well, if we're leaving the remaining New Year's 6 Bowls out of the playoffs, where are we going to have the playoff games played? I've seen a lot of concepts where the first round or 2 is played at the higher seeded team's home field, but that's not all that fun for the players, and it doesn't really fit the tradition of bowl season to not travel in the postseason. So for the first round, I wanted it to be rotated between these venues that currently host non-New Year's 6 games with the following new names because, let's be honest, the Mayonnaise Bowl. After that, the second round I think would be cool to be played in locations that don't have a deep history with bowl games. So I chose these cities to rotate between hosting the games. After that, the final 4 would be the same as it has been, with the semifinals being New Year's 6 Bowls and the championship being played in a different city each year. Just to wrap up my thoughts on all this, there are a few things that the NCAA could consider implementing to make things just a little more interesting without having to change the playoff format completely. First off, make every team join a conference. Just about every independent school has an easier schedule, and it isn't fair to the selection committee to give them exemptions for not having a conference championship. Secondly, get rid of conference divisions. They are stupid and pointless, and the modified season proved that in 2020. And finally, number 3, expand the selection committee significantly to include actual unbiased football experts. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but the committee now consists of 13 members, and 5 of them are current Power 5 athletic directors, and another 5 have direct ties to Power 5 teams. So yeah, that's pretty much my idea, and it's completely flawless, so if you would do anything differently, well, then you're wrong. So I definitely don't want to hear you comment below what your ideas would be, and I also don't want you to subscribe to me, so don't do that either. But anyways, thanks for watching. I'll see y'all later, and stay safe out there.
One thing